Hello there and welcome to You Talking at Euronet Plus. Today we're going to talk about TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership between the EU and the US. And the negotiations are ongoing, and there's a fifth round of negotiations right now in the US, and it's also a topic in the campaigns ahead of the EU elections. And with me in the studio to talk about TTIP is Peter Chase from the US Chamber of Commerce in Brussels. Welcome.
Delighted to be here.
And also Philippe Lamberts from the Greens in the European Parliament. Welcome.
Well, thank you.
So we're going to start with a very short and simple question. Is TTIP good or bad? And I would like to answer in a very short way in 30 seconds. So Peter, you can start.
Thank you very much. The short answer is TTIP is very good. It's a very smart thing to do. The Chamber's been behind the idea of resurrecting an old European idea for an ambitious transatlantic trade and investment agreement since 2010. And we did it because for three reasons. One, it's geostrategically important as the first treaty between the United States and the EU. Two, it's economically crucial because we need jobs. And three, we can do this agreement and do it quickly. All three of those reasons combine to us to say, this is a no-brainer. We should move it quickly.
And Philippe Lamberts, do you
think?
think?
It's a no-brainer, and it's bad for our environmental standards, it's bad for social standards, but above all, it is a threat to the ability of elected lawmakers to make law. Basically, it will privatize lawmaking in Europe going forward. And, well, this is not something that is compatible with democracy. So that's the basic issue. And we may discuss about potential benefits, but then we'll see whether there are any benefits and who will profit from them.
And you mentioned the benefits, and let's have a look at some figures. And these are from the European Commission and a study that they ordered. So the trade between the EU and the US amounts to 2 billion euros per day. So it's a massive trade between the EU and the US. The EU economy could increase 0.5% per year, which is like 120 billion euros per year. And for a average European household, it could be almost 550 euros per year. And the US economy could grow 90 billion euros. So I would like to ask you, Philippe, doesn't this all look quite nice?
No, I graduated as an engineer specialized in applied mathematics and especially modeling. I've been modeling physical phenomena, and I could see that this is already very difficult. Modeling the economy is something almost too impossible. I mean, similar models have been used to predict that the US would benefit from the North American Free Trade Agreement to the tune of 20 million jobs, additional jobs. And actually, the result of reality was minus 900,000. So I can tweak any model any way you like to deliver the result that you want to have. That's not a difficult thing.
Figures?
I've, of course, zero trust in these figures, but just assume for a moment that these figures would be true. It's interesting to see that the assumptions that they are making is the most extreme scenario where basically any trade barrier would be removed, all of them, right? And that would just deliver 0.5% increased growth. Now, assuming that this is true, the very misleading figure is the average that they quote, 500 euros more per household in Europe. I mean, who can say that if profits are made, they will flow to the pockets of citizens? Because basically, those who stand to benefits are the constituents of the chambers of commerce, basically the large trade multinationals, the internationally active multinationals whose shareholders stand to benefit. I do not dispute that there may be benefits to shareholders of large multinationals, but does that profit society? I would really question that. This myth of trickle-down economics, make the shareholders richer because ultimately everyone benefits, that has never been proved right. There's no scrum of evidence demonstrating that, but they would like you to believe that so as to make their shareholder richer. At the expense of who? Well, the consumer, the workers, the citizens, basically. These are the people who are going to pay to increase the profits of shareholders. And sorry, but society is not in the business of making shareholders rich.
And Peter, you're American. Are these growth figures also questioned in the US?
No, for a number of reasons. You wanted a debate, and I think we can have a good one because I disagree with almost everything that Mr. Lamberts said. First and foremost, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce represents 3 million businesses around the interest of 3 million businesses around the United States in every sector and every economy. The vast majority of our members happen to be small businesses. When you take away, and we'll talk about this later, when you go into the details of this agreement, the people who will benefit the most will in fact be the smaller companies. And we can talk about that. Then, of course, when you talk about shareholders, well, who are shareholders? Mr. Lambert and I maybe. I have a retirement account, so I'm a shareholder as well. Well, but we'll go on then. Now we'll talk about the modeling and the economics. See, the research institute that did this, the Center for Economic Policy Research in London, is one of the most highly regarded economic think tanks in the world, not just in Europe. I think Mr. Lambert is correct. Whenever you're modeling the future, you're dealing with uncertainty. So you try to use as best as you can models that will generate numbers, that will generate some sort of forecast, because you have to have an idea about what a public policy is going to do before you adopt that public policy. None of us sees the future perfectly. But as far as I know, every single economic analysis of this agreement has shown benefits. Why? Well, we'll talk about that. I've already said it's to the SMEs. The reason why is that when you're talking about two highly integrated economies, and where we have, as you said, $2 to $3 billion of trade a day between us, and you reduce the costs of doing business, then you provide people opportunities, new opportunities to create jobs. Let me just give one small example that goes to your small and medium-sized enterprise. What if the Food and Drug Administration agreed that a food manufacturing establishment here in Europe that had been approved by European authorities to make food for the market, that any of those establishments could now export to the United States? It opens huge new opportunities. This is one reason why the Food and Beverage Association of Europe is for it. This is one reason why European farmers are for this. And I'm sorry, those aren't the people.
I can tell you, I'm speaking with farmers, and not all of them do support this thing.
You know what? I speak to farmers too, and I was just here at the European Policy Center.
Agribusiness. You speak to those guys. Well, we speak to other people.
Copa Kojima would disagree with that. Moreover, let me give an example.
Do you see any benefits, no. Even if you are right in that?
Not a single one.
Not a single one, because even if there is a financial benefit to someone, I've been trained in doing cost-benefit analysis. And of course, if there's benefit to someone, the question is at whose cost, at whose expense is this benefit being made?
So you believe in zero-sum games?
Well, I do believe that this is a zero-sum game because the size of the wallet of the Americans and the size of the wallet of the Europeans is limited. And mind you, we have seen growth in the US since, well, a few years after the crisis. So the US economy is growing again. Look at the statistics available in the US, US Census Bureau. Who benefits from that growth in the US? How many Americans? 1%. 1%, my friend. And that means that actually this is the objective, is basically targeting those who stand to benefit most.
You know,
it's completely misleading to try and sell this thing as if it would benefit society at large.
You have a really interesting view of what benefit is. My daughter has been unemployed.
Yeah.
Okay? She got a job. You and I are both lucky. Andreas, you're lucky. We have jobs.
Sure.
If someone gets a job, I think that's a benefit.
At whatever cost? At whatever cost?
Okay, well, let's see.
7 million people in Germany. I'm not speaking about the US. 7 million people in Germany have a job and are poor, right?
Okay.
So having a job is not even a guarantee of having a decent job, of being able to make ends meet. And basically what you want to do is increase competition to the benefit of shareholders and to the detriment of the working conditions, wage conditions of everyone in Europe. You know, so sorry, I don't play that game.
It's really interesting. He cites employment in Germany, and there is a German well-respected economic think tank that estimates that this particular agreement could create 160,000 jobs in Germany.
What kind of job?
Well, so let's talk about the also about the worries that Europeans have that it could weaken the standards of environment and social protection.
It's not the objective.
So you mean that we are going to aim with that agreement to raise the social, environment, healthcare standards? No, because the point of this agreement, and read the mandate, is basically to have mutual recognition of norms. In that case, history shows that it's not the most expensive norm that wins, it's the least expensive norm that wins. That is the one that is least demanding in terms of health, quality, food standards.
But also the European Commission has said
He wants
that
competition between the legal systems in the US and Europe, and we know who stand to benefit
But
from
also
that.
the European Commission has said that they will never ever weaken the European standards.
They say that,
you don't
but-
trust
but-
the European Commission on this?
Of course not, because that's the objective of the game. It's lowering, and that's, I quote them, it's lowering the non-tariff trade barriers. It's not making norms higher, it's to make them lower. Sorry.
Okay, in which
Did you say,
case,
Peter?
I'm sorry, once again, this is a great debate because we disagree again. You know, it's interesting that you, as a member of the European Parliament, would say that mutual recognition leads to lower standards.
Of course.
Because the model for this is, in fact, the EU experience. The EU, and much of what it's done over the years to create the single market, has been to use mutual recognition. And the idea of mutual recognition, unless you want to say that the entire EU process has led
No,
to the
absolutely
lowering
not.
of
But there's a
standards.
big difference.
Okay, good. I'm glad
There's
you
no,
don't-
there's no transatlantic democracy. There's a pan-European democracy.
My turn. There is the whole idea of TTIP is to create bridges where we can between US standards and European standards. And there's a very good reason for this. That would, quote, reduce barriers without reducing the level of standards. And that's the important part. The way you do this, the reason it has to be this way is that US regulators are overseen by the US Congress. They're overseen by American voters. American voters have no interest in seeing our standards reduced, quote unquote. It's part of our democratic process. And again, unless you're going to criticize every US government regulator, then good, I'm glad, because we have quite high standards in the United States.
Yeah, and who is paying? Now, let's look at the cost of US democracy. A campaign every other year. A campaign every other year that costs on average 7 million per seat in the US Congress. Who pays for this? Is it the US citizen or are these private interests buying lawmakers in the US?
So now you're going to question US democracy.
Of course.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm not going to get into that debate with you
but
because
that shows-
I have to say that I find that pretty affronting.
Well, I'm sorry, that's
something
fact.
that
That's
is-
fact. Look at who pays the
Your view-
campaigns.
I'm sorry, I'm a US citizen.
Sure.
I vote. I
course.
believe very strongly in my democratic system. And
Good for you.
I'm quite surprised to hear you criticize it quite so strongly.
But something that is also being criticized in Europe is the investor protection, where civil society groups and NGOs say that could make U.S. companies sue European states for billions and billions of euros. I suppose that Philippe, you share this worry.
Yeah, quite obviously. I mean, either you have trust in the legal system or you don't. But basically, ISDS is there to allow companies to sue states, basically for. In the name of their right to profit. Basically, if one legislation is detrimental to the profit of a private company, that company can sue, and not even in front of the legal system, but with private jurisdictions. I mean, come on.
So should we be worried about this, Peter?
No. And let me explain why. When you do I worked, as you know, for 30 years as a U.S. diplomat. During part of that time, I negotiated investment agreements. Investment agreements have 4 guarantees that the two countries give to each other: that they will not discriminate based on nationality, that they will provide fair and equitable treatment, that if, in the event of an expropriation, they will provide full compensation, and there are free transfers of capital related to that investment. Both of us, both in Europe and in the United States, we hold these principles very dear. That's why we are both the largest hosts of, as well as homes to, foreign capital flows, foreign direct investment. When you talk about investor-state dispute settlement, it is an enforcement mechanism that's related only to those 4 obligations. So in order to bring a case, either the investor needs to have been discriminated against based on nationality or expropriated or denied due process. If one of those things happens, yes, you can go to the courts. But not always are you going to get correct redress in the courts because courts have to uphold the law of their land to which investments are subjected. This is a question of an international obligation that needs to have international oversight. That's why, for instance, you have the WTO dispute settlement basis. That's why, for instance, in the EU, you have the European Court of Justice, because it's a transnational thing that it goes beyond domestic law.
You're laughing, Philippe. What do you say?
Yeah, because, well, basically it says it all. It says that rules made for international trade are superior to democracies. And that, well, there's a level of sovereignty that goes above that of an elected democracy, and that's basically that kind of arrangement. And that's where we fundamentally disagree. We all know that we have already enough problems to solve with our national or domestic democracies, not to basically make their lives even more difficult. I mean, I want, as a European lawmaker, to be able to pass laws that we deem here appropriate. And if those create distortions, as you would call that, of markets between the US and Europe, fair enough, because we may have differences in assessing what's good for society and what's not good for society.
Except that you've put it incorrectly. The only time that anyone could bring a case would be if the EU adopted a law that intentionally discriminated against an investment
Philippe
based on
Morris
its national...
suing Australia for labeling obligations on cigarette packs? Come on. I mean, EISDS is used and abused across the world right now.
Well,
and so, sorry, I have more regard for the sovereignty of citizens than for the sovereignty of shareholders of Philip Morris.
Well,
there's hierarchy between the two.
In which case, I mean, it's wonderful that you say that, because one of the great things about a treaty that's being negotiated between two countries is that in order for that treaty to go into effect, the democracies, that is the European Parliament, the Council, and each of the member states will need to ratify this. So it's going to be subjected to democratic control.
We have seen democracies surrendering themselves to non-democratic regimes before. We have seen parliaments surrendering their powers. We've seen that.
Okay, and that is, in fact, if you look at the Treaty of European Union, precisely what all the EU member states have decided to do.
There's a big difference. There is no transatlantic parliament that is superior to that. Once you have surrendered it, you will trust private bodies to decide whether a parliament can pass a new law.
Then what you're saying is that the EU should never enter into any international agreement. Because
no, absolutely not, but not one of that kind.
So what is that kind? Any international agreement places obligations on the European Union as well as on the United States.
Sure.
Both of us, as democracies, voluntarily undertake those obligations on our rights to do whatever we want. And once again, you have to remember, what are we saying we are willing to do? We're willing not to discriminate based on nationality. We're willing not to expropriate without paying compensation. These are not things that we should be afraid of. We don't do them. We don't think that there is any danger, and I guarantee you that the U.S. Congress would not enter into an agreement that it felt somehow reduced its ability to legislate in the interest of the American people.
But one reason why we are here discussing all this is that we don't really know what they are discussing in these negotiations because they're mainly it's done behind closed doors. If we have nothing to worry about, why shouldn't it be more open?
Well, when it comes to investment, if anyone goes onto the internet and Googles U.S. model BIT for Bilateral Investment Treaty 2012, the text of the Bilateral Investment Treaty is on the web. And that text is precisely what the U.S. government is going to be proposing in these negotiations. So there is a lot of information out there. There's an interesting distinction that needs to be made between how the governments who are responsible for negotiating communicate with their stakeholders, including members of the European Parliament, and whether or not and how the texts themselves are made public during the negotiations. You've been involved in business, you've been involved in politics, and you've done, I'm sure, a ton of negotiation. Negotiation is one of these processes where people put forward ideas, and they're trying to come to an agreement. Mr. Barroso, when he was at the US Chamber on April 30th, talked about this. He said, if you had made every text that was being negotiated at the European Council level or the Council of Ministers, you would never have had anything agreed. Because it's a process of negotiation, in the negotiation, you keep that closed because people they're doing a dance in order to get the best results for them.
So we need to finish, but I would like you, Philippe, to finish off. Is transparency a problem when it comes to TTIP?
Yeah, of course it's a problem because one, the European mandate has not been made public, and here I must credit Karel de Gucht from wanting to make it public, but a number of European governments don't want to make their negotiation mandate public, so that's a big issue. Second, I can understand that negotiation is not something that happens in the open. I fully agree with that.
Okay, I'm glad.
But what I also see is that private interests have access to negotiation documents, which shows again that within the stakeholders, as you call them, well, some are more equal than others, and this is of course intolerable.
Interestingly, because
and by the way, the US has made it very clear to the European Union that any working documents would not be it would not tolerate them being shared with European governments, let alone lawmakers. So I mean, if you're so afraid of transparency, something must be that wrong with this thing.
You started off by saying that texts during negotiations aren't made public. In the United States, we do have a process to share texts, and it's very closed and restricted tests with, for instance, our members of the Congress. And I'm sure that if the EU develops something like that and discusses it with the United States, there wouldn't be a problem. But what's interesting about part of what you said about privileged access, I wish I had privileged access to negotiating documents. You know where I got a copy of the negotiating mandate? It's from a website called bilaterals.org, which is a civil society place, which is wonderful at getting text, usually well in advance of me, and my colleagues. So I think that there's a misperception here. There was a really interesting exchange not too long ago during one of the negotiating rounds here, where someone asked Mr. Garcia Becerro, who is the lead negotiator here, why he was meeting at a reception with some business interests. And, wasn't that bad? And he responded, well, look, when I was last in Washington, I was invited by the Public Interest Research Group to a cocktail reception, and I went there, and I'm going to this one because I've been invited, and if you invite me, I'll come to you too. I'm here, he said, to talk to anyone who wants to. His door is open. I think the Commission has done a wonderful job publishing things. Most recently, just last Thursday, it's come out with 5 new documents for what it wants to ask about regulatory cooperation in the automotive, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and cosmetics areas. They're all on the web. They're all available for anyone to look at and read. They're going through an interesting consultation process on investment issues, which is very public, and they're looking for input from people. That is a process that reflects a similar transparent exercise we went through in the United States when Mr. Obama first came into office. It took 3 years to go over our investment text. Everyone was included in this, and we've ended up with a text, interestingly enough, that retains investor-state dispute settlement.
So we'll see in the end if there will be more transparency in these negotiations. They will end in, hopefully, in end of the year of 2015. Thank you, Peter, for being with us in the studio today, and thank you, Philippe, and thank you to all our viewers and listeners.